My experiences with anime have brought me to some seriously crazy places before. From the surreal weirdness of Evangelion to the more modern vanilla isekai, I feel like I've seen quite a bit and kinda know my way around the anime sphere. But I'll tell you what, I was not ready for the absolute insanity of the anime I'm about to tell you about right now. Serial Experiments Lain is a cyberpunk psychological thriller that has some of the coolest themes, aesthetics, and presentation I've ever seen. It's absolutely one of the best anime of all time, and there's nothing you can say or do to convince me otherwise. Although I'm sure that won't stop some of you from trying. During the 90s and early 2000s, psychological and philosophical overtones were extremely popular. You could see this in mainstream movies like The Matrix or The Butterfly Effect, but this was even more pronounced in the anime world with movies like Ghost in the Shell, because it wouldn't be a scruff video if I didn't at least mention it, Paprika, Perfect Blue, and Akira, just to name a few that come off the top of my head. All of these movies have at least a few parts in them that would make Snoop Dogg question whether or not he's had one puff too many. With some of the more heavily psychological ones like Perfect Blue or Paprika really reaching into that surrealist presentation, and Serial Experiments Lain is absolutely no exception to that. The show presents its ideas in a way that definitely makes you think about what's going on or what you're supposed to get out of it. So why don't we take a closer look and explore what makes this show so great and why you, my fellow weebs, should watch it if you haven't already. Our story begins with a glimpse into the
present day. Present time.
And of course, by present, we mean 1998. But instead of getting pictures of you opening your N64 on Christmas Day, every episode we get glimpses into a modern cityscape which focuses on its impersonal nature and obsession with technology, as evidenced by the heavy focus on telephone lines, city lights, and droning electrical buzzing. By the way, that's something that does not go away, so you better get used to that. We then meet a girl named Chisa, a normal, average, everyday middle school girl going about her daily life dealing with average, everyday struggles like popularity, boys, and grappling with the voices in her head telling her that she no longer needs her body anymore and that existing in this world bound by the chains of her mortal flesh is purposeless and she should
seek ascension.
You know, normal middle school girl stuff. This eventually comes to a head where, after some extensive back and forth with her and this mysterious text wall, Chisa decides to listen to it and find a way to free her consciousness from the binds of her current existence. All this to say, she decides to reenact the Bring Me to Life music video. Besides some of the absolute gruesomeness of this first scene, we start seeing some of the first anomalies in the way that people act. Now, normally when you see a middle school girl fall to her death right in front of you, you tend to just be, I don't know, at least a little bit concerned. But no, nobody cared. The most you hear is some guy in the background saying that he had no involvement in it.
I don't know anything. We got nothing to do with this.
Yeah, the people in this world are cold as fuck, that's for damn sure. This actually has a lot of artistic and moral connotations behind it, which I'll get into later in this video, but suffice it to say, this desensitization to tragedy is something to keep in mind. Fast forward a little bit and we meet our protagonist, Lain Iwakura, and other than having one of the most iconic designs ever, Lain just seems like a normal, quiet middle school girl just trying to get through day-to-day life. But it won't be long before that illusion starts to break. During class, one of Lain's friends is seen crying at her desk, distressed by a prank email that she received claiming to be Chisa. You know, yeah, her. Now, obviously, everyone, including Lain, reasonably assumes that this whole thing is just some sort of cruel, sick joke, orchestrated by some of the students in order to get a rise out of them. But you see, the thing is,
as much as I love cruel, sick jokes, I'm afraid he's not joking.
Yes. Later that night, Lain pulls out her old computer and finds that she's received the same email. Though, interesting enough, Chisa is able to respond back pretty quickly to Lain, telling her that she actually isn't dead, but instead freed from her mortal body, allowing her to explore the technological world at her leisure. Yeah, and you guys thought I was exaggerating earlier, didn't you? This technological world is called The Wired. So, for simplicity's sake, it's best to just think of The Wired as the internet, as it's mostly just meant to be a metaphor for it. But in case society wasn't tone deaf enough, The Wired actually functions almost exactly like the metaverse is supposed to. You know, with the exception of being able to link your consciousness into everything using the Schumann resonance. But as interesting as that is, it's kind of irrelevant to this video, so I'm just gonna move on. So after this conversation, Lain begins her descent into the rabbit hole of trying to find where the barrier between The Wired and the real world lies. And with the help of her PC PC-loving dad with the sickest setup of all time. Like seriously, look at this thing. This setup makes my PC look like a goddamn potato despite probably only having the computing power of a GameCube. Lain acquires her first high-end PC and takes the first steps into being able to take full advantage of her technological skills. Oh, and in case you haven't noticed already, we start seeing a few anomalies in the way that the world seems to be functioning. I.e. that Earth.exe is more bugged out than Battlefield 2042's launch. Lain tends to just fade into different locations. People spawn in and out of existence. Text can't render properly for Lain. Like seriously, there was zero quality control here. Good fucking God.
What kind of place is this?
Moving on, we see that technology is able to interact with humans a lot more intricately than it does in real life, with nano devices essentially being able to take the form of drugs simply by vibrating at certain frequencies. We also get to see a glimpse of something a little out of place. Well, I guess a little bit more out of place than usual. While nothing is confirmed and we only get the tiniest look at her, it appears as though that Lain has a bit of an attitude shift, acting a lot more bold and throwing around attitude, and her friends take notice. Now, Lain's friends didn't exactly talk to her during their night out, but they did question her about it the next day, being almost impressed that Lain came out of her shell that much, that quickly. But when questioned about it, Lain has absolutely no idea what they're talking about, leading them to believe that she just must have been a completely different person that just somehow looked almost exactly like Lain. Oh, another thing worth mentioning, Lain is an absolute hide-and-seek master. How do I know this? Well, she's able to spot government agents, the men in freaking black, watching her in the middle of a top-secret stakeout that absolutely nobody can know about. After a little while, we find our cast back in the Cyberpunk club colloquially named Siberia. I know I should have like a snide remark for this, but I got nothing. It's just a cool name for a club. But it's not too much longer before we're interrupted by gunshots. The gunman seems to be having a serious mental breakdown, which I guess is to be expected considering it was him who we saw take that nano drug earlier in the episode. And after a bit of what seems like just an absolute existential crisis, our shooter gets a good look at Lain and seems to absolutely recognize her. He spouts off a lot of nonsense like how Lain's making him do this and how she needs to leave him out of it, and how the wired and real world can never interact with each other. And Lain seems to be affected by this as well and goes into a bit of a trance-like state. The shooter points his gun at her, threatening to shoot her, and all she does is merely say,
"No matter where you are, everyone is always connected."
Somehow merely hearing the words of such an iconic line was enough to make the gunman decide to turn his weapon on himself and, let's just say he frees himself from his mortal body and allows his consciousness to explore the wired. Now, what's really weird, other than literally everything leading up to this point, is that everyone, including Lain, seems to be largely unfazed by this. Again, usually when you see something like this happen, and you actually have the blood spatter on your face, you would think that there'd at least be a little bit of a reaction other than Hangman's humor the next day. Because that's my job, damn it! But surprisingly enough, everyone actually does question why they aren't more fazed by it. But they largely just seem to brush it off like it's not really that big of a deal. Alright, so because this video was supposed to encourage you guys to watch the anime, if you want to find out what happens next, you're gonna have to go watch the show for yourself. Especially because the fact that spoilers in this show are a little bit odd. Since the show has this really surrealist take on things, what is or is not considered a spoiler is actually rather blurry. Plot points that in most anime would really matter a lot for how the world works or how characters move forward often really don't play that big of a role in Serial Experiments Lain. But if I was to sit here and describe everything that happened in the show, there really wouldn't be much of an incentive to watch it, now would there? The show is definitely meant more to try to illustrate concepts and philosophical ideas more than it's meant to paint a vibrant world with deep characters, you know, like most stories do. And it's because of this that I won't pretend like Serial Experiments Lain is made for everyone. The presentation being so, well, big brain, for lack of a better term, can actually put a lot of people off. Even when we take super popular shows like Evangelion, I've seen plenty of opinions in even my own comments section that say that this show is not good due to its surrealist presentation in the latter half of the show. And not to sound like your average Rick and Morty fan here, but watching things like Serial Experiments Lain or any other surrealist anime like this requires some sort of an intellectual investment on the viewer's part. Like in Evangelion's case, if you didn't understand that the whole latter half of the show was mostly meant to be an actual metaphor for how depression works in your brain, you wouldn't really understand it, and therefore you probably wouldn't like it. And the same thing goes for Serial Experiments Lain. Since the show presents its plot points and philosophical meanings in such an uncanny way, you really have to think about what's going on in order to understand where the anime is going with everything. And for most people looking to turn their brain off and just enjoy some anime, the show's obviously not going to appeal to that. Couple that with the fact that not only are psychological thrillers not as popular now as they were in the 90s and 2000s, but the more popular Western psychological thrillers like The Matrix had to be paired with a lot of intense action in order to keep their audience invested. And Serial Experiments Lain is definitely not an action anime. Outside of arguably having some more intense moments, there's just about zero action throughout the whole thing, which again, for most audiences, probably won't have them as invested. Now, there are some things that can turn off some general audiences, like the fact that the art style can look a little bit grotesque in some places. And if you're into dubs like me, then the dub can be a bit...
Your little imaginary friend. Or something like that.
wonky. But if you can get over these couple things and are ready to invest yourself in an anime, Serial Experiments Lain is one of the coolest, most rewarding anime that you can ever watch. Now, I know that that's a pretty bold claim, but hear me out. Besides having one of the coolest aesthetics ever, Serial Experiments Lain is really notable in one major way. The show is able to predict the way that we live today very accurately. The whole anime focuses around Lain's interaction with the Wired and what the greater implications are of that for everyone else in her world. People are shown time and time again to be distant and impersonal, and glued to their phones, computers, or at least some kind of technology, which in and of itself is already pretty prophetic. Obviously, you can go anywhere in real life, and people are much less personable than they were even a few decades ago. And you can't go anywhere without being glued to your phone or at least seeing somebody who is. A lot of this is shown via the impersonal nature of the everyday people in the show, and the fact that most people are even desensitized to seeing gruesome deaths. Now, that may be a bit of an exaggeration compared to how we actually live today. I mean, obviously if you saw somebody oof themselves in front of you, you'd probably have at least a little bit of a reaction. But the metaphor is definitely still relevant, seeing as how our society really has gotten to be less personable since the rise of the internet. But where some of the real predictions and questions come about is when we look specifically at Lain herself. Lain struggles with a lot of things during her journey in the Wired, but one of the biggest takeaways is that Lain seems to have alternate personalities that just run wild in the Wired. These personalities get her in trouble with her friends and family, but ultimately they're still her, or at least part of her, which then causes her to struggle a lot with which one of her personalities is the real Lain. This is meant to be more of a direct metaphor for how we as people actually do take on different personalities when on the internet or even in real life to adapt to different situations. But as any YouTube comment section will tell you, on the internet, with its increased anonymity, these alternate and most of the time hostile personalities have a lot more room to run wild. And they can become unrecognizable from how you act towards people that you know in real life. I mean, look at how many shy, quiet people in real life get on the social media and turn into the biggest asshats known to humanity. It obviously happens all the time. And the last thing being that after a certain point, Lain spends so much time in the Wired that it's starting to become difficult to discern which is the real world. Think of it this way. If you had one continuous dream that you came back to every single time you slept, and your sleep schedule gradually made it so that you were sleeping more and more, wouldn't you start questioning which one was the real world and which one was the dream world? This kind of idea has been explored in plenty of media over the years, like, for example, the movie Avatar. But in Serial Experiments Lain's case, it's particularly poignant, because the anime poses that same question, but to how much time you spend on the internet. So far, we're able to tell which one is the real world because, you know, you have to access the internet through screens at either your desk or on your phone. But who's to say that we wouldn't start questioning this if we had to connect to the internet via VR headsets in like a metaverse setting? Or even more crazy, what if Elon Musk's Neuralink allows you to connect to the internet just using your brain? it would start getting a lot harder to discern which is the real world. Which is crazy to think about. Stuff like this was completely chalked up to science fiction when this anime came out like 20 years ago, but here we are a few decades later, and what seemed like a bit of an overreaction to the rise of the internet actually became a serious question about how far we're willing to let technology take over. I mean, we are literally living in a time where virtual anime girls on the internet get signed to major record labels, sing one takes on mainstream YouTube channels, and rent billboards at Times freaking Square. Like, it's actually insane how much the internet overlaps with the real world the more you think about it. I could go on about the philosophy of this anime all day, but I'm actually kind of running out of time. The script is already like 9 pages long. But suffice it to say that Serial Experiments Lain is an absolute masterclass in surreal storytelling, and its philosophical questioning of technology combined with its cyberpunk aesthetic make it easily one of the coolest anime to watch and a completely unforgettable experience. Serial Experiments Lain is one of my favorite anime of all time, and I cannot recommend it enough for those of you looking to get a little bit more out of your anime. And hey, after you do, you can use what you learn to flex your giant pulsating brain at your next social gathering. Or your next Reddit argument. Whichever floats your boat. But hey, this time I don't really have much for you guys. Honestly, I could sit here and try to give you excuses as to why it's been almost 3 months. Holy shit. I could give you excuses like I've been sick or the holidays were up here, but like I said, it doesn't exactly matter. I mainly just wanted to thank you guys so much for watching again, and for, sticking around with me and dealing with my crap. I always enjoy making these videos and getting them out for you guys, so I guess like, comment, subscribe for more videos, and yeah, look forward to the next one. That's about all I got today, so see you guys in the next one.